The Protestant world is most deeply and pitifully deplorable. Why is this the case? Because, firstly, the Protestant community has remained unaware of the underlying causes of the Reformation, and secondly, the true face of Martin Luther has similarly been obscured and hidden from view. I keep telling my students, if I repaint a university red and have a swimming pool installed and let's say set up a bar, then this is a reform. However, if I raise the university to the ground and build a circus or something similar instead, then this can no longer be called a reform.
I never refer to the Protestant Reformation as a reforming, as a reformation. It was a revolution, and it was a revolt against the prevailing theological order. And with that theological order came a whole cultural and political order that flowed from it.
When I'm asked by my children what the Reformation was, I explain to them that the king simply decided to rob the church. The king appropriated what once belonged to the church. He dethroned the Pope and put himself in his place. Now I am the head of the church, ordered the king. All church property is now mine, and I will make all future decisions. The family members on my mother's side are evangelicals, and my grandma once said, "Now finally I want to read the writings of Luther for myself." So then my grandma familiarized herself with his writings and said, "Good heavens, I must become a Catholic at once. I must become a Catholic at once. But this is absolute madness. So it's God that's supposed to be evil, not us? But this is madness."
Everybody's going to create Luther as they want to create Luther. So if you want to make Luther into the founder of modern freedom or the founder of the modern democracy or the founder of feminism or the founder of whatever, go ahead and make him into that, because people do not have the habit of actually testing what it is that they're saying with the real historical Luther.
Noi non ci rendiamo conto di cosa ha significato.
We do not realize the significance of overthrowing St. Peter, just as if we were to destroy the basilica now, which in any case can't be completely ruled out given to the times we live in. So if they were to demolish the basilica and erect a new one, we would all be deeply shocked. But that has already happened. And the decision had been made by the humanist Renaissance popes. Luckily, a marvelous colonnade and an equally magnificent dome were constructed. But today's basilica is 400 years old, whereas its predecessor was 1,200 years old. But the previous St. Peter's Basilica was stupendous. Stupendous. It was Constantine who began its construction. It was here that all the relics of the martyrs were found. It was there that the coronation of Charlemagne took place 1,200 years ago. All of that was razed to the ground and destroyed. Such a radical decision was taken during the late 15th and early 16th century and was closely related to the spirit of humanism and the Renaissance. It was tantamount to breaking away from the medieval world. Back then, it was not yet a theological divide. Theologically, things were correct. It was a mental divide, foreshadowing what was going to happen to the Church. What we have at the beginning of the 16th century AD is the civilization known as Christendom, the Corpus Christianum. As rightly pointed out by a number of researchers, the civilization in question was a byproduct of the evangelization undertaken by Papal Rome. The beginning of the great geographical discoveries, the invention of the printing press, and the onset of the Renaissance humanism constitute the marvels related above all to the Catholic Church and Catholic monarchs. Europe then experiences an economic prosperity, which is evidenced by a rise in wealth. Earlier still, we can discern such signs of budding capitalism as banking in the Italian city-states in the 13th and 14th centuries. Catholics built cathedrals, universities, as well as ironworks. New industrial centers appear, among others in the Holy Roman Empire, divided at the time into a number of kingdoms, principalities, and sovereign units such as archdioceses, abbeys, and free imperial cities.
Martin Luther
was born in Eisleben, where he also died. Contrary to what these dates would imply, Luther's birth in Eisleben in 1483 and his death there in 1546, he himself practically never lived there. However, his family, whose roots were from elsewhere, moved here because Martin Luther's father wanted a job in the mining industry. In those days, the area was known for its copper mining and booming economy. It was clear that one could make a lot of money there. Here's a miniature model of the city of Eisleben in Luther's times. We can see the building where Luther was born on the edge of the city. Later on, the family moved out, and at the end of the 17th century, the house was burned down. The house in which Luther died was located near the marketplace, which we can see on the miniature model. At one time, we could see Luther's deathbed in the house. This, however, gave rise to a regular wave of pilgrimages. People would visit the house and chip bits of wood off his bed, for example. These were taken as keepsakes and even worn around one's neck as lucky charms. In particular, it was considered helpful for a toothache. Naturally, this entire custom was much too similar to the Catholic veneration of relics, so much so that radical steps were taken by an opposing theological movement. Subsequently, the bed was burnt down in 1707. As a result, the house where he died faded into oblivion. Later on, when attempts were made to locate it again, a completely different house was identified. Thus, Luther is commemorated both in a place which has partially been preserved as a 17th century house and in a building which has been furnished and arranged as a memorial place.
Well then, not exactly the same house, not precisely the right street. These are typical problems with Martin Luther's politically correct biography. Things were not going to turn out the way they allegedly did. Not only the replica buildings or the burnt-down furniture, but also basic facts and all the Jubilee narratives are no more than fabrications for political expediency. Whose political orders might those have been? Surely those of the Prussian King Frederick and his successors, of Bismarck, Hitler, or Honecker, the brutal regimes which happened to choose Luther as their patron saint and founding father. And rightfully so? Let's find out.
Luther comes from a family where physical violence was used on a regular basis. His mother would often hit him to the point of drawing blood. His father killed his own farmhand with a horse harness.
Seinen eigenen Knecht erschlagen.
Miał bardzo impulsywnego ojca.
He had a very impulsive father who, when he came home on horseback, was more than capable of beating his son with a whiffletree. And we know what a whiffletree is, a very hard object consisting of both metal and wooden parts. Perhaps, as a result, Luther's approach and thinking came to be marked by a certain brutality that we are going to talk about. Martin Luther, the son of a peasant miner metallurgical family, as his father occupied himself with all these jobs, received his education in Wittenberg and then studied briefly in Leipzig and in Erfurt. It's worth stressing that it was not theology that Luther studied, but civil secular law.
His father ordered him to study law in Erfurt.
And then the following comes about. Luther dueled with his friends, even though dueling was something strictly forbidden. If it had come to the notice of the administration of justice that two masters of arts had been dueling, they would both have been condemned to death in line with the region's laws at the time. And what happens next? Martin Luther is wounded, and he is then looked after by the woman with whom he has illegitimate children. Here we come face to face with a factor which clearly cannot be left out, because Martin Luther was known virtually till the end of his life in 1546 as a short-tempered person and a womanizer, which he himself never tried to conceal. What's more, he boasted about it. Thus, one does not reiterate any propaganda created for the sake of religious argument or any black legend aimed at Martin Luther. With his wounds healed, Luther returns to university, and another duel takes place.
Soon after his MA exam, Luther wounds a university friend in a duel. The wound is fatal.
By making use of his knowledge of law, Martin Luther escapes the death penalty. Where to? To a monastery.
Luther took a chance on his monastic right of asylum. The administration of justice was obliged to respect the monastic right of asylum. And his university friends wrote to him, "What on earth are you doing in a monastery? What shall we do with your cohabitant and your bastards?" The word they used refers to illegitimate children. What are we supposed to do with them now that you are in a monastery?
But Martin Luther, you have no vocation. You are a lawyer. And Martin Luther wrote back, "Friends, were I to leave this dark monastic cloak, they would cut my head off."
Luther replied, "I have to stick to this damned monastic cloak. Otherwise, they will cut off my head."
Certainly, in the official version, this turning point was dreamt up. Most authors carry on reproducing a legend about a thunderstorm, during which Luther allegedly vowed to join a monastery. The primary sources were critically examined only by Dietrich M., whose works, however, remain ignored. In order to get a better understanding of the situation in which our anti-hero found himself, it's worth realizing the cultural role played by the massive religious organization which he just joined.
Definitely, it was the church that gave us civilization. It was the Catholic Church that brought the light of Christianity to Norway, which had been engulfed in pagan darkness before St. Olav's arrival. It was the church that gave us the first code of Christian laws. It was thanks to the church that forced marriages came to an end. It was also thanks to the church that it was no longer acceptable acceptable to put infants to death. The same infants which previously were abandoned in forests and left to their own devices. It was no longer permitted to kill the elderly, who used to be hurled into the abyss. Women were now able to reject unwanted suitors. And monasteries, as well as nunneries, cropped up all over Norway, spreading knowledge about the faith. It was monasteries that led to the development of agriculture. It was they who introduced all sorts of improvements and continued scientific and experimental development. Norway owes all this to the Catholic Church.
In those days, one can talk about Europe with one emperor, one authority, and one faith, the Catholic faith. One language, Latin. It was a Christian civilization, society characterized by a great diversity on the one hand and by a profound unity on the other. There were different states, customs, habits, traditions, but there was one faith and one vision of the world. As a result of the crisis, or rather of the Protestant Revolution, this civilization breaks apart. After entering the monastery, Luther actually undergoes a permanent personal crisis, which manifests itself in up to 30 or so sacramental confessions a day.
He was possessed of a very unsteady conscience. He wanted to know, have a guarantee that he was saved while he was still here on earth. And of course, that's ridiculous. You can't be at your destination on your way to your destination.
Luther did not have a true vocation and conceived an idea in his mind that the moral law given to man by God is impractical. As he had received the sacrament of the holy orders, he was now a Catholic priest. Though this was no consolation to him, he would say to himself how difficult it was going through his first Holy Mass. For him, the words repeated by a Catholic priest during the transubstantiation were hard to accept.
Now, the next stage is this very vague but clearly important experience that he talks about. His so-called tower experience.
When Luther is in the latrine in the monastery tower, he experiences what he himself calls an illumination. This comes about while he is reflecting on a certain Holy Bible verse from the book of Habakkuk, which says that it is a good thing to live for the sake of faith alone.
And this experience in the tower, focused or working with his examination of Scripture, leads him to believe that he has discovered the key to Scripture. His idea is that man, after original sin, is totally depraved, and since man is incapable of pleasing God, that means that he can be redeemed and be a sinner at the same time.
So he poured through the Old Testament and the New Testament looking for something, and he stumbled across that famous line in Romans that we were justified by faith. And for him, that was the ta-da, the eureka moment. He said, oh, all I need is faith.
All generations of theologians, Protestant and Catholic alike, maintained that young Luther was faithful to the Church and to the Catholic theology. However, there are Luther's personal notes on the works of St. Augustine and other church fathers which he studied. Coming across Augustine's words, fides cartatem formata, faith formed by love, Luther radically disassociates himself from them and says sola fides, that is, faith alone.
Ma questa non è la dottrina
But this is not a church doctrine, because according to the church's teaching, it is with God's help that one attains the grace of salvation through good deeds and faith. Clearly, it is God that ultimately grants the grace of salvation, but there is some need for cohesion between God's grace and man's free will. All is possible. God did not give us an impractical moral law. Quite the opposite. He gave us the moral law, which with His aid can be observed. There is a great gulf between Luther's idea and the Catholic approach.
C'è dunque un abisso fra
Luther is not the first one to try to come up with a convenient theory to justify various human problems. It was already in early Christianity that there appeared a wide range of heresies, quite predictable in their persistent replication. Theological errors have always been bound up with revolutionary political doctrines related to areas ranging from the sexual to the social one. The rhetoric of an apparently more perfect piousness was accompanied by the radical questioning of priestly, marital, and property rights. Terror and devastation invariably follow suit. In the Middle Ages, Luther had predecessors like the Provençal Cathars, the English Lollards, and the Czech Hussites. After rising up in rebellion, he himself will notice the analogy by admitting, with a certain dose of surprise, we are all Hussites.
This is the house where Martin Luther lived. As an Augustine hermit, he first served here as a monk. He came on a consolation mission, first to Erfurt, and then as a professor to Wittenberg. It was here that he worked and gained knowledge. So Luther goes through some sort of liberating experience. This is because he himself was constantly in search of the path leading to justification before God. And he concluded, I don't have to do anything more. I don't need to buy indulgences. I don't need to go to priests, as all this has already been done through the death of Christ. I am already saved. And this conviction sets him so free that he changes his surname, his previous name being Martin Luther. That's what his family was called, Luther. Firstly, he changed German into Greek. He was called Martinus Lutherius, or Liberator. And afterwards, the TH from the Greek version was transformed to his family name, so that now he was called Martin Luther, spelt with a TH.
When Luther went off to teach at the University of Wittenberg, he became converted to the humanist approach. A return to the rhetorical, a move away from the logical, a move away from the philosophical. But the humanists disliked all of that, and they were steeped in a literary mode of expressing themselves rather than a logical one.
Luther was a restless spirit who found compensation for his phobias in ferocious and disorderly work, in the exegeses of the Holy Scriptures, in theological studies, and chaotic deliberation. This work, however, made him neglect his own spiritual life, to such an extent that he ran out of time for the necessary prayer. Here, in his own testimony concerning the years preceding the events of 1517, namely the question of indulgences. As he put it himself in those days, he no longer said his breviary, although this was obligatory for all priests and monks.
So the Bible then becomes his focus, Luther's focus. And that is something which is going to give him a means of being able to reach people on a popular level that is much greater than any kind of philosophical-based argument.
So Luther begins to focus on the Bible, which then enables him to influence people and gain popularity with them. He would say he no longer prayed, nor have enough time to celebrate the Holy Mass because he had to study. He had to preach. He also supervised other monasteries. In short, Luther fell victim to feverish activism. Just a few years before his revolt in Wittenberg in 1517, Luther made a journey to Rome. this resulted in his shock and outrage. There, he was scandalized to see that under the Pope's auspices occurred a return to ancient Rome's art standards, which meant the affirmation of the human body. Apart from the fact that in search of his inner comfort, Luther had long before believed that doctrinally Catholic theology was unacceptable and laid down too heavy a burden on contemporary man. And we can say that in the 16th century, Dr. Martin Luther was a contemporary man. Furthermore, what implicated papal Rome was its very openness to the ancient civilization, which a visitor from Germany perceived as a sign of decrepitude.
We've had bad popes. We've had a history of bad popes in the church. 2 or 3 particular periods. During the Renaissance, there was a lot of immorality, a lot of financial corruption. However, when Jesus gave Peter the keys, he gave him the keys to ensure the unity and the continuation of the truthful teaching. Peter, as we know, when he received the keys, was far from a perfect man. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And the very next scene, he turns around and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So right there, our blessed Lord himself makes the distinction between the office and what the office is established for, and the individual man who is in that office.
At the beginning of the 16th century, we have to deal with the Renaissance papacy. The pontiffs from Italy's most powerful families are elected. The House of Medici, a famous Italian banking family, produces a few popes who wanted to tear down the old St. Peter's Basilica and erect the one which we know today. Therefore, these popes were in need of enormous sums of money.
The papacy became an instrument used by the powerful of this world, who were obsessed with the buying and accumulating of church offices. The church was undergoing another crisis in its history.
What has become of the ministry? Where is the evangelization?
The church's external appearance as far as the sacraments are concerned remained the same. Having said that, many people had a mental attitude characterized by secularization and inner emptiness. Once upon a time, indulgence was announced in the region of Saxony, central Germany. Naturally, this was considered from the start as a cynical way of handling the means of salvation.
A certain wealthy noble, Albrecht Hohenzollern of Brandenburg, was 24 years old and had already been in charge of 2 dioceses, and he wanted another diocese. The third diocese was one of the 7 offices which influenced the election of the emperor. In order to be able to pay the Pope for his nomination for the Archbishop of Mainz, Albrecht incurs a debt. He borrows the necessary money from the banking house run by the Fugger family. To get out of this debt, the said Albrecht of Brandenburg becomes involved in collecting money contributions coming from the indulgences earmarked for funding the building of the new St. Peter's Basilica.
The potential abuse is obvious. Money brought the remission of penalties meted out in purgatory. Unfortunately, some tactless preachers, perhaps not necessarily actuated by bad intentions, took advantage of the situation by setting up a genuine indulgence trading business. There was a Dominican friar called Tetzel who made explicit financial offers. In return for donating money for the building of St. Peter's Church here in Rome, one would automatically be forgiven one's sins. And this was the primary reason for Martin Luther's rebellion, the nailing of these 95 theses to a door of a Wittenberg church. It is said today that this in fact did not take place at all, but what is beyond a doubt is that it was in 1517 that Martin Luther came out. In any case, in his 95 theses, he harshly criticized the superficial nature of the system of granting indulgences and of the church authority. Curiously enough, one of the 95 theses theses said, "Wrong are those who think the Pope has no authority to grant indulgences." But who reads Martin Luther these days?
Is this a generous act of moral dissent, or rather, a crafty attempt at torpedoing the interests of others? Luther as an Augustinian and Tetzel as a Dominican represent two different corporations, while Frederick III, Elector of Saxony and Luther's supporter, has every reason not to tolerate any competition on his territory. The competition, which excludes him from any share in the giant operation of transferring the German cash by the bank house of the Fuggers of Augsburg to the bank account of the Hohenzollers of Brandenburg and Rome. The better we get to know Luther, the harder it will be to believe in any action on his part without a political cover-up.
All books mention that Luther rebels against the scandalous practice of indulgence trading, which was a source of revenue for the church. This is just an excuse. Had it been a true problem, it would have sufficed not to donate any money, and it would have all been over. So it was just a pretext considering what must be mentioned at this point. The rebellion against Rome had been growing for a long time in this Germanic world. What is often forgotten is the political economy. Had Luther not enjoyed Frederick the Wise's, Elector of Saxony's support, the game with Rome would have been lost. The prince owned a vast collection of relics stored in Wittenberg, as well as the privilege of indulgence trading, enabling a person to reduce their stay in purgatory by up to hundreds of years.
And Luther had been there. He had been at Frederick's place, and he knew about the collection very well. He was perfectly conscious of the inventory of relics, thanks to which pilgrims could gain indulgences, naturally for money, by visiting Frederick's residence. So the question of indulgences is but a pretext for the entire revolution unleashed by Luther.
One element which accounts for the success of the revolt is the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. Luther is one of the first people to take advantage of print as an instrument of propaganda. The theses were widely disseminated by means of the new printing technology. Intense and heated debate over these theses began. It is then that we can observe some signs of agitation, first among the academics and then also among the common people. In Rome, they did not realize immediately what had happened. When Luther's revolt breaks out, Pope Leo X shakes his head and shrugs his shoulders, saying, "This is some disagreement among the monks." Actually, it was a dispute which could set the whole of Europe on fire. But Leo X was a pope who spent every October hunting. His other passion was the theater. In the months of Carnival, performances were put on in Castel San Angelo, Castle of the Holy Angel. These people were unaware of the gravity of the situation. Some disagreement among the monks. Well, not really. Unfortunately, it was something much worse, which they did not realize soon enough. Perhaps the only person to understand it was Cardinal Cajetan, an illustrious theologian who was sent to Germany.
Martin Luther was summoned by the Church, by Rome, and the Prince of Saxon was his advocate and asked that he not be sent to Rome, but that he would come to Augsburg. After the Imperial Diet of 1518, Luther arrived in Augsburg, stayed at the church St. Anna, which was full of reformers, this church, and he was summoned to the house of Jacob Fugger the Rich, to the Fugger Palace, because there was where the cardinal from Rome, Cardinal Cajetan, was staying. And Luther was expected to recant his 95 Theses, but instead he challenged the cardinal, and so they discussed many theological issues. This very special conversation is documented, so you can get an idea of what the conversation may have been like.
And when we go through it, we are struck by the contrast between Luther's vehemence and Cajetan's patience and gentleness. As a matter of fact, Cardinal Cajetan gave Luther as many as 3 chances, and the talks went on for 3 days. Ultimately, Cajetan gave up his struggle in the face of Luther's obstinacy. Lamentably, the dispute was growing larger, and soon Luther was charged with questioning the Church's authority. Then Luther went even further.
He is an ideologue. He is an ideologue. He has got one starting principle: the total depravity, the incapability of the individual to please God, and as a result of that, the inability of any kind of institutions, natural or supernatural, to aid the individual to please God. This breaks down the entire need for the sacramental cycle, the social authority of the Church. He's only going to discover this bit by bit as he brings it out into the public forum.
On account of the purely material abuse, Luther challenged the very essence of ecclesiastical institutions. In his treatise on the Babylonian captivity of the Church of 1520, Luther called into question the Church's entire teaching on the sacraments. Leo X delayed condemning Luther for too long. He hesitated, he wavered. Finally, thanks to repeated pressure from theologians, especially Cajetan, the text of the 1520 papal bull appeared Ex Surge Domine, which lists Luther's errors and condemns him as a heretic. Even before being excommunicated by Rome, Luther publishes a text called Adversus Execrabilim Antichristi Bullum, defining the Pope as an antichrist. He says there, "Before you excommunicate me, I will excommunicate you."
The ostentatious burning of the papal bull is a version spread by Melanchthon after Luther's death and never mentioned by the latter. Historians tend to view it as an instance of the heresiarch's inner determination and courage. Seldom do they question the external guarantees and forces which were at play at the time. If, during the ongoing propaganda campaign, the consecutive cities visited by Luther, Augsburg, Leipzig, Worms, were practically inundated with leaflets by his followers, then who were those supporters? Luther's charisma alone is definitely not enough. Even today, an operation like this would require substantial financial investments and logistics. Who was capable of providing all of this at the time?
First, there are the cities, and it is there that the Reformation is becoming most dominant. City councils accept and introduce the Reformation among their townspeople. Lutheran revolt could not have taken place without the aid of German princes, starting with the Elector Frederick of Saxon, who protected him. If he had not received any support, everything would have come to an end, just like any other heresy in the past centuries. And it is politics that begin to play an important part, politics and economy. There is interdependence between politics, economy, and the interests of the princes. So Luther is playing with fire. He lets a spark fall on an inflammable ground, which is Germany of that time, and he immediately gains full approval. On the other hand, in 1519, Germany has a very young emperor, Charles V, who has just come to the throne. The emperor is not able to deal with the situation, nor does he have good advisors.
In 1521, Luther was staying here in Worms to defend his writings and had to appear twice before Charles V. And in a nutshell, he refused to recant. Unless he was proved wrong on the basis of the Bible, he wouldn't recant anything because he couldn't do so as a prisoner of his own conscience. And so he concluded with the words which one can also read here on Luther's monument. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. He probably did not say these exact words, but this ideally sums up his stance. This world's largest monument to the Reformation represents the whole evolution of the movement. Luther dominates as the central figure, with the so-called reformers resting at his feet. Petrus Waldus, representing France. Back and to the left, John Wycliffe, representing England. John Hus, front, right, representing Bohemia. And Girolamo Savonarola of Florence, Italy. Their ideas were picked up by Luther, who made them heard. To the left, behind Frederick the Wise of Saxony, we can see Johannes Reuchlin.
He's a great humanist. Reuchlin was very much influenced by the Jewish Kabbalah, including the world of magic. Magic was taken seriously by a number of humanists. And in being influenced by this, Reuchlin studied Hebrew to understand the Kabbalah. He became the focus of a battle back in the decade before Luther appears as a public figure on the scene, which is referred to as the Reuchlinstreit, the famous Reuchlin battle, a kind of humanist controversy against allowing the Kabbalah and the Talmudic books to circulate. But Reuchlin argued firmly for their being allowed to be free. And his voice was heard above the others. It was the immediate prelude to Luther, which is hugely important and almost nobody ever talks about. By the way, I should add that his nephew became Luther's chief follower, Melanchthon. But the reason why it's a preparation for Luther is because, in this case, printers and publishers were realizing with the Reuchlin battle that this was a moneymaker. And you do have a kind of experience that's gained from the Reuchlin battle that is able then to serve you in the indulgence controversy that comes afterwards, because you do know how to promote and attack and what works and what does not work.
A number of researchers view the case of Reuchlin or the Jewish book controversy as crucial to Luther's success. In his works, Heinrich Graetz said that it was the Talmud that awakened the sleeping giant in the Germans, even though they themselves do not confirm it. Moreover, Louis Israel Newman expressly maintained that the Jewish issue helped to spread the flame of the Reformation. There are numerous quotations which testify to great hopes aroused by Luther among the Jewish diaspora, and vice versa. Luther publishes a text about Jesus Christ who was born a Jew. Accomplished Hebraists are consulted during the collective work of Luther and Melanchthon's team on the translation of the Bible. With time, disappointment will follow owing to Luther's later anti-Jewish texts. This, however, will not discourage the Jews from supporting the spread of Protestantism.
So he was on his way back from the Diet of Worms and let himself be kidnapped by Elector Frederick the Wise's men. In doing so, the elector took him under his wings. Afterwards, he had Luther sheltered at Wartburg Castle. Up till then, Luther looked like a monk, as he was still a monk. Now he grew a beard, let the hair on his tonsure regrow, which signifies his profound transformation. And here is Luther's room, the place where Martin Luther remained in hiding for 10 months under the pseudonym of Knight George. It is also here that he went through his most productive stage. During the said 10 months, he wrote a great many texts. Among others, he did one of the most important things. He translated the New Testament into the widely understood German language. And this speaks for itself. We can see how important this event, this period spent at the Wartburg, turned out to be for all Germans.
But it was certainly completely different from what these legends say. Holy Scripture, hitherto, had been concealed from the nation. It had been materially and financially impossible for each private household to own a copy of the Bible. But already in the 15th century, a number of translations of the Holy Scriptures appeared. The brilliant thing that Luther did was to make use of the clerical Saxon dialect, which was approximately a standardized version of both Upper and Lesser Germania. It was into this dialect that Luther translated the Holy Scriptures, and thanks to the widespread use of the printing press, this particular edition became so widely available, a sense of novelty appeared.
So Martin Luther has this idea that this is it. This is all I need. I do not need this corrupt church. I do not need these sacraments. I do not need Mass. And when he stripped everything away, all that was left was the Bible. And so that's why Protestantism begins with and ends with just the Bible. The problem, however, with just the Bible, sola scriptura, is who interprets it. The church gave birth to the Bible, not the other way around. It wasn't until the beginning of the 5th century that we really had an agreed upon, this is the canon of Scripture. These are the 73 books of Scripture.
It was the church that established the so-called biblical canon, that is, the books which are regarded as genuine and authoritative, consequently denouncing the church as a realm of an alleged papist antichrist while emphasizing the significance of the Holy Scriptures as the only authority for believers was self-contradictory.
Martin Luther didn't care about that. He didn't care so much that he took, of the 73, he threw out 6 and bits and pieces of other ones. So Martin Luther shrunk the Bible by about 10% as far as the numbers of books are concerned.
And he called them epistles of straw. Well, for example, the Epistle of James the Apostle was flawed in Dr. Martin Luther's eyes because it contained passages which openly contradicted his teachings, because the Apostle said that faith without deeds is dead. Besides, Luther deliberately manipulated his translation in some places. For example, when it came to St. Paul's epistle to the Romans.
He actually inserted a word in Romans on that line, we are justified by faith. He inserted alone. We are justified by faith alone. Now, many of his followers, his disciples, people in league with him, told him that's probably going a little far. So Protestant Bibles today don't have the word alone in it, but originally his German Bible did, and that's very reflective of his mentality.
Also, in one of his letters, Martin Luther reassures his followers by saying, if any papist try to point out this inaccuracy to you in a theological dispute, tell him that the translation was done by Dr. Martin Luther.
You tell him that Dr. Luther would have it not that way, and what Dr. Luther says is good enough. So the interesting point here in history, when it sort of played itself out, is for a man who wanted to get rid of a pope, he really set himself up as the pope.
His prince, the prince elector, keeps him under protective custody at this castle called the Wartburg. Meanwhile, his followers begin to deduce the logic. They begin to deduce the logic, and they start making all kinds of changes to the liturgy, engaging in iconoclasm, which means image smashing.
Le couvent de Luther a été désaffecté.
Luther's monastery was deserted. Luther had set a bad example, and many other priests followed in his footsteps. Nuns denounced their vows, got married, and in many places across Germany, bishops, priests, and their supervisors converted to Lutheranism.
But in order to be able to pursue his particular project, he needs physical force behind him. He comes up with this famous phrase that the princely and the city authorities become necessary bishops. There's no room for a church, and hence that means the authority of the state.
A part of German aristocracy was greatly interested in the Reformation because of the huge wealth accumulated by the monastic communities as a result of their considerable efforts, and we know that Martin Luther called for the desertion of the monasteries.
And all that wealth owned by those whose existence Luther refuses to accept, who is going to take it over? The princes who convert to Luther's Reformation. It's a miracle that not all German princes converted to Lutheranism. It's a true miracle. If Luther allows the princes to become nabobs or tycoons, it's a miracle that Emperor Charles V of Habsburg should have resisted.
Monasteries were being devastated and looted, with monastic families being dispersed. The most brutal methods were used against those who refused to leave.
If you understand the gospel properly, then believe me, this cannot be solved without disturbances, without public outrage, and without rebellion, writes Luther to Spalatin, Prince Frederick's secretary. After all, you won't make a quill out of a sword and peace out of war. Somewhere else, he explains, it's better to murder all bishops, uproot all monasteries and orders, than to allow even one soul to perish. Because if they won't listen to God's word and abandon themselves to folly and rabies, what thing other than a violent revolt that will wholly uproot them can happen to them? And we, Luther says, will be splitting our sides with laughter while it is going on.
Luther, the genius, gives the entire power to princes. He also gives them all the church's money. Of course, this is unjust. In fact, a civil war breaks out immediately. In the years 1522 to 1523, knights, i.e. the ones who are not princes and did not stand a chance of inheritance, provoke a revolt.
According to Martin Luther's teaching, the church should be separated from its material wealth. This sounded attractive to numerous nobles who suffered from, let's say, chronic and structural problems with their own budget.
On behalf of the German evangelical church, they demand part of the Catholic Church's wealth for themselves. The war is in progress. The said nobles and knights are quickly defeated, but soon afterwards a popular revolt breaks out.
In the years 1524 to 1525, Germany is racked by the Great Peasants' Revolt led by Thomas Müntzer. When the peasants rose, they did so because they had inferred a superfluous nature of any authority from Luther's principle of free interpretation of the Bible. Thus, they rose against the secular and ecclesiastic authority. Then Luther paradoxically called for military intervention. He insisted that the peasants who were captured should be hanged, tortured on a breaking wheel, dismembered, and submitted to other cruel punishments.
Well then, firstly, he lets the princes take over all the church's wealth in the name of God. But he doesn't want the peasants to do the same. Luther produces a horrifying text against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants. He says, "Let whoever can stab, strangle, and kill them publicly or secretly, in the conviction that there is nothing more poisonous, pernicious, and diabolical than a rebel, just as if you were to kill a mad dog."
Luther writes to the German aristocrats, "Crush these wild scoundrels until the last one is slain."
The Revolutionary Army lose their last battle at Frankenhausen. The rebel communist priest, Thomas Müntzer, is beheaded. Luther denies knowing Müntzer early enough not to end up like him. A similar fate will await many other extremists who fail to conform to the current situation, which finds its proper expression in Luther. Müntzer, who accidentally did carry a rainbow banner, is commemorated by the allegorical panorama created in the course of 10 years by a renowned East German painter, Werner Tübke. However, in the 16th century, it is the Bolsheviks that have to give way to the Mensheviks. What triumphs is the compromise with the authorities.
The Protestant camp is extremely divided from the very beginning. For example, Luther regards Ulrich Zwingli, the leader of the Reformation in Zurich, as a heretic. We can see then that it's a kind of dialogue that does not enrich anyone.
Dialog, który za bardzo nikogo nie ubogaca.
They're mingling and fighting. The various towns along the Rhine have their own variants. Then you've got also the problem of the Anabaptists splitting off from the Zwinglians. Then you get the Unitarians entering into the picture. So you've got all these forces that are expanding and dividing like mad. And, by the way, all quarreling intensely with one another, as well as with the Catholics.
If there is no magisterium of the Church, then anyone can feel free to open the Bible and interpret it in their own way. This is the root of unavoidable sectarianism.
Luther does not represent a radical side during the Protestant Revolution. Luther comes across as quite moderate compared to many Reformation revolutionaries. His followers, friends, and many other reformers such as Zwingli or Calvin are all much greater extremists. But it was he who set everything in motion. He had pressed the accelerator and did not take his foot off the pedal for the rest of his life.
His students and friends took notes of everything he said in shorthand. The notes were then collected and published in very interesting books entitled Table Talk. So 10 years after the massacre of German peasants, Luther says, I killed all the peasants during the rebellion, and their blood is upon my head. But I put it all on our Lord God. He commanded me to speak like that. And here we arrive at the principal contradiction inherent in the Lutheran concept of man.
In Luther's opinion, one of his most important works is De Servo Arbitrio, on the bondage of will, which is a reply to Erasmus of Rotterdam's treatise on free will. Luther puts forward the following thesis there. Man is not free in his relation to God.
And Luther writes to Erasmus of Rotterdam, It was only you, Erasmus, that understood me properly. What I am preoccupied with is not indulgence trading, purgatory, or the papacy. What concerns me is the bondage of the will, which is my primary consideration. It is not a poor man that is guilty, but an unjust God. It was God who made Adam fall. It was God who made Judas betray him. God as the creator of both good and evil. He even extended his evil to Christ and put him to death for the first time in heaven and for the second time on Mount Golgotha before our very eyes.
So this God is, according to Luther, a tyrant. And Jesus of Nazareth is described as simul justus et peccator, at once just and sinner. Nowhere in the Holy Scriptures is Jesus of Nazareth called a sinner. But Luther's faith has nothing to do with the Catholic faith, as the latter is based on reason, and Luther repudiates reason as the devil's whore.
Luther is the total enemy of rationality because he cannot deal with this idea of capturing God by means of reason, by means of logic.
And Luther says, in this most important work of his, on the bondage of the will, that God predestines one man for hell, irrespective of the good he does, and another for heaven, irrespective of the evil he does. This is the theory of absolute predestination, which will be later developed by Calvin. It's a kind of giving up on God's mercy. God arbitrarily decides on a person's salvation or damnation regardless of their individual virtues.
indipendentemente dal merito degli uomini.
It's as though I tell my students that they must do what it is that I tell them to do in order to get through the course, but whether or not they pass with flying colors makes no difference in terms of whether they ultimately get their college degree.
Gott ist böse. Das ist
God is evil. This moment is decisive.
Gott muss
And for Luther,
böse sein,
God has to be evil,
damit
so that Luther himself could be liberated from his own evil.
Bosheit befreit ist.
It is not me that is evil. I myself have no freedom. It is God that predetermined my evil.
Böse zu sein.
God gave me this evil nature.
Natur gegeben.
Marcin Luther dokon
In doing so, Martin Luther satanizes God.
pisze
In his commentary on the Book of Psalms, the following formula appears. Summa, Gott kann nicht
Gott
Gott sein.
nicht Gott sein.
Muss
der
Sufer der Teufel werden.
Summa
Summa, God cannot be God until he becomes Satan first.
szatanem.
In the year when Luther has his On the Bondage of Free Will published, two other events which ultimately unveil the aims of his revolution take place. The world's first Protestant state comes into being in Prussia. Albrecht Hohenzollern, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, another ex-monk turned Protestant, transforms Prussia into a secularized state, or, in other words, simply grants himself property rights. This happens on Luther's advice, with whom Duke Albrecht makes friends, regretfully, with the Polish king's approval. This is the moment of historical tragedy. The Prussian homage, an open questioning of the fundamental principle of Christendom, that is, the separation of spiritual authority and secular power. Luther deals another blow to the old order by getting married, in line with the new fashion.
So wie Christus
Just as Christ redeemed us at Easter, Luther says, so did I redeem Katharina von Bora by having her abducted from a cloister, by marrying a nun.
die Nonne zur Frau genommen haben.
Ponad 20
Over 20 people died at Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora's wedding feast.
i Katarzyny
This shows the moral condition of the community gathered around Martin Luther.
zgromadzonego wokół Marcina Lutra.
The wedding unleashed a brawl that led to the death of more than 20 people.
Zabójstwa ponad 20 osób.
Questo è importante.
This matters because an Italian proverb goes, "Tell me with whom you go, and I'll tell you who you are."
W piśmie
In his text on matrimonial matters, Luther demands that the emperor should redefine marriage as a marital contract.
umowę małżeńską.
He rejects the sacrament of matrimony.
Marriage is, as Luther puts it, an earthly thing which the Church has nothing to do with.
Możemy
We can get married, conclude marital contracts, and cancel them. Thus, Luther introduces the institution of divorce, and in his text of 1530, he flagrantly calls for a death penalty for a woman guilty of adultery.
Kary śmierci.
And he asks himself a similar question with regard to a man.
Sobie też podobne pytanie w odniesieniu
If a
do
husband
mężczyzn.
betrayed his wife, should he be sentenced to death as well?
Czy też powinien ponieść karę?
Oh no,
O nie.
sure, there should be a penalty for adultery for a husband, but a light one.
Ale niewielka.
Nun sagt ja.
And now he says, indeed, if Katharina von Bora, as my abducted nun and wife, refuses to comply sexually with my will, she must be replaced by a maid. I can't free myself from lechery. After all, I received this very nature from God. And as a result, I can't live without being able to satisfy my sexual drive. So let there come a maid when a wife does not want to.
Wenn Frau nicht will.
Ten člověk se nemusí snažit
Man does not have to try to be better and more perfect. He doesn't have to make any efforts to live in accordance with Christian morality. All he has to do is believe, and he will be saved. Luther expressed it on numerous occasions in his Latin formula, "Be a sinner and sin boldly, but believe even more boldly."
He himself admits that he embraced at least 3 women at a time, and that he filled his life with piggishness and drinking, to which he had every right. He says he had to drink about 7 liters of sweet wine a day, so that his good mood did not leave him.
The main reason for our saying no to Luther is not his personal life. This aspect is of secondary importance. We say no on grounds of his deeply false vision of religion and morality. Clearly, this brings about profound cultural and social consequences. As we know, in the first place, the interest of secular power was involved, as it was the prince's favor that Luther intensely sought. Indeed, he would even allow bigamy in certain specific cases justified by the new pastoral care.
Philip I, Landgrave of Hesse, nicknamed the Magnanimous, is one of the rulers championing Luther's cause. It's a man whose sexual conduct is totally uninhibited, but he is one of the most important figures among the Lutherans, and Luther needs him. Philip of Hesse is married to Landgraven Christine of Saxony, with whom he has 7 children. However, Philip writes to Luther and Melanchthon and asks them to let him marry one more woman, a very young girl. Luther and Melanchthon respond immediately. Getting married in public is certainly out of the question, as this would unleash a scandal which we do not need. However, your spiritual guide allows you to join in supplementary matrimony in secret.
Puoi anche fare un matrimonio supplementare.
So Philip takes a second wife. Of course, the whole matter is revealed. This causes a great scandal. The scandal is so serious that it puts an end to Lutheran teaching in Germany. And what does Luther do? He advises Philip to deny everything and adds, "A lie told in the name of God and in defense of the gospel. The pure gospel is not a sin. Quite the opposite, it's a virtue."
What is striking is the intense hatred demonstrated by Luther in his successive writings and sermons. Hatred for the Pope, hatred for the Holy Mass, hatred towards the ideal of a chaste monastic life, hatred of good deeds.
He uses language to the effect that there is nothing that could be more horrible that the worst whore does, that could match up to the horror of the Mass.
Luther calls the Pope the Antichrist and says that the papacy is the realization of Satan's will.
These are insults and vulgarisms. However, genuine theological arguments are nowhere to be found.
So Luther needs to criminalize the Church with the Pope and the cardinals, to depict the Church as an institution which is actuated by money alone.
He had obscene drawings done, drawings which Protestants themselves keep out of sight as they are ashamed of them.
He prepares these drawings in cooperation with Lucas Granach, one of Germany's greatest painters. It's hard to say which ones are more indecent than others. Payable to the Pope, the arch-satanic Pope and to his cardinals. The leaflets can naturally spread much more easily than any other thing. This one is signed by Luther. D stands for doctor. And here again we have the Pope. The Pope held by Medusa, by Satan. He is being rocked, always with a tiara on his head. Multiple anal birth. This is how all the cardinal hats and papal tiaras are born. This tiara is topped with an unnatural ringlet, which is a poo. This is exactly what Luther wants to teach the Germans about Rome. Rome has always despised us, has always exploited us. You must liberate yourselves from Rome.
Mentre divampava, si estendeva.
During Luther's revolt, the famous sack of Rome takes place. May 1527. Emperor Charles V is irritated with the Pope. Since the Pope is known for his pro-French policy, the Catholic Emperor has Rome occupied, and his troops consist of Protestant German mercenaries called Landknechts, among others. For 8 days, Rome becomes an inferno. Cardinals, bishops, priests, and monks are being persecuted. Priests are sold as slaves, while the churches and palaces are devastated.
Luther's responsibility for the sack of Rome and for other equally appalling and apocalyptic events in the contemporaries' eyes is indisputable. Not only is he morally responsible for the tragic events, but in a more direct way, he is also to blame for sedition. Only a few years earlier, Luther writes to one of his affluent correspondents, "Why shouldn't we attack these cardinals, popes, and all this Romish Sodom with every kind of weapon, only to wash our hands in blood afterwards?" On other occasions, he keeps dreaming one should capture the Pope himself, his cardinals, and everything that comes along with this impiousness. Once we have got hold of them as blasphemers to God, we ought to pluck their tongues out of their throats, through their necks, and nail them to the gallows one after another. They can be permitted to convoke a council, over there, on the gallows, or in hell with the devils.
Any crisis in Europe, the Europe of Christendom, has always encouraged Islamic expansion. Louis II, the Jagiellonian king of Hungary and Bohemia, perishes at the Battle of Mohacs. The Antimuro Christianitas falls, as it was Hungary that was hitherto the bulwark of Christianity. It is at this time that the troops of Suleiman the Magnificent arrive at the gates of Vienna for the first time, and Martin Luther sees this as fair and divine retribution for papists.
The Turks are the scourge of God, and whoever resists them acts against God's will. This is Luther's reasoning. He neither idealizes nor recommends Islam, but perceives it as an effective form of punishment meted out to the Roman Antichrist. Thus, from Istanbul's viewpoint, the Protestant Revolution constitutes a useful sabotage behind enemy lines, and vice versa. According to a historian, Fischer Galati, Lutheranism in Germany owes its consolidation, opportunities for expansion, and recognition to the Ottoman imperialism. There exists overwhelming evidence for the Turkish sultan's subsiding Protestant princes. It is noteworthy that Cardinal Cajetan did not come to Augsburg for the sole purpose of listening to Luther's effrontery. He had a more serious mission, which was the formation of an anti-Turkish crusade. It was to be funded by a portion of financial resources gathered from the Indulgences campaign. Luther's revolt put an end to this plan and ruined any chances for the unity of Christendom in the face of the Turkish onslaught.
One of the myths concerning the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation is the conviction that it was a grassroots and spontaneous movement. However, once we analyze the historical context of the German, French, Scandinavian, and English Reformations, there is no escaping the fact that it was a top-down process. It was above all the reformation of the princes, of the rulers, and of the nobility, as well as a substantial part of the clergy, including bishops.
Henry VIII got rid of the Catholic Church, made up his own church, and then said, "Now divorce me from my wife so I can marry my mistress." And that's what it was. And oh, by the way, I'll chop her head off later. And all you Catholic bishops who disagreed, either you get in line or I'll chop your head off. And he chopped the head off of one of them. So the Anglican Communion was founded on murder and divorce and adultery.
Frankly speaking, everything that comes about in England is caused by one man's debauchery, which is outrageous. One can say that the church that comes into existence as a result is the most disgraceful church in the world.
Henry VIII used it as an opportunity to seize thousands of properties from the church. Monasteries, farms, churches, cathedrals. He pillaged the church, ransacked the church of all of its property.
King Gustav Vasa of Sweden acted along similar lines by declaring himself head of the Church of Sweden. The church was disintegrated, and its considerable temporalities were taken over by the royal authority. Beforehand, we were both under the church's and the bishop's rule. Now, Scandinavia became a collection of societies solely subordinate to the power of the kings and their officials.
There was some commotion in Bergen among the elite families. But generally speaking, Norway did not undergo any social revolution interested in the Reformation. The Norwegians found themselves under the pressure of the Danish king, who spent a great deal of money on military enlistment and needed considerable funds to pay his soldiers and mercenaries. And he found converting to Lutheranism very convenient, as he was able to seize the church lands and wealth. And these were vast lands, which from then on belonged to the king's realm.
And in this way, this original accumulation of capital occurred due to the theft of the church wealth, the wealth which in its major part had been spent on the needs of the poorest. The whole network of hospices, the then hospitals, shelters, all that we now call charity organizations had previously been primarily taken care of by monasteries and financed with their revenues. It was no coincidence that one of the characteristic signs of the new times was a huge number of beggars on the roads and in the cities of the English kingdom. The phenomenon had never been known before, and the beggars were basically the orphans from the shelters they had lost in the aftermath of the confiscation of the church's properties. When it comes to people's belief in God, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus, we have numerous testimonies that the process of converting to Protestantism needed a lot of time and generations. People maintained their veneration of the Virgin Mary, the Catholic bishops, and the Pope in Rome. However, the kings and their officials were already involved in the Protestant Revolution. Considerable changes took place in the Catholic domain. The images of saints were thrown away. Calvin-inspired Reformation forbade, in a way, the use and veneration of images. Just look at the old churches and the decapitated statues of the saints. It was a crucial point in an incredibly radical Reformation triggered by Calvin. Let's not forget what Calvin got up to in Switzerland, where he set a system of terror, a terrorist theocracy, so to speak. Many people were condemned and burnt there. The Night Council was in operation, and its duty was to judge the alleged heretics. The death penalty was administered to the Catholics and also for some Protestants. Miguel Servet, a Spanish Protestant, unlucky enough to end up in Geneva, was practically burnt alive. This is a true inquisition, utterly ruthless in comparison with its Spanish counterpart. The destruction of altars and the installation of the so-called Lord's tables in their place, the destruction of liturgy and the banning of Latin, all for the people, of course. The royal court complies, but what do the people do? The so-called dark masses take up arms, for example, in the south of England, where the Western Rebellion breaks out. The insurgents demand, among other things, the return to altars, to the veneration of saints, to the Holy Mass, the return to Latin, and the return to holidays honoring God's saints. The common people take up arms, but are exterminated by the royal army.
Catholics are in need of Catholic priests. To be able to lead a Catholic life, one needs the Holy Mass and the sacraments. And all that was completely forbidden in Norway. So much so that every Catholic priest who came to Norway was sentenced to death in advance.
In Elizabethan England, the Mass was said in cellars. Cassocks and habits were hidden in lay people's houses, at a farmer's, a smith's, or other common people's places. If these people were discovered, they were massacred, with their legs and heads being hanged, nailed to the city gates. Truly, this is applied totalitarianism.
In the countries conquered by Protestantism, Catholic faith becomes a passport to the scaffolds. Priest hunting becomes a popular occupation. The number of martyrs keeps growing. The coming centuries will witness Catholics being discriminated against as second-rate citizens. Contrary to popular belief, in the wake of the Protestant Revolution, Europe is plunged into a deep civilization crisis. In England, for instance, it is only in the 18th century that there appear furnaces whose displacement approximates that of the ones built by Catholic monks 2 centuries before. At the beginning of the 19th century, William Cobbett documents a decline in the standard of living and continuing impoverishment of the English people as a result of the Reformation and its regulations. A radical increase in the number of working days following the abolishment of Catholic feasts leads to burdening the common people to a much greater extent than before the Revolution. Rogue states earning their livelihood by looting and warfare keep mushrooming. The false doctrine of predestination gives anyone liberty to do as one pleases. This can be observed in remorseless exploitation and unscrupulous conquest. Protestantism opens the season for witch hunts and absolves extortionate moneylenders. It sanctions a division into humans and subhumans, which paves the way for apartheid on the one hand and eugenics on the other. The Protestant propaganda produces effects by stressing acts of Catholic revenge and leaving their primary reasons unsaid. Black legends bring to light hundreds of victims of the Catholic reaction, while hundreds of thousands of victims of Protestant pacification fall into oblivion. It was only recently that Niels Dacke, the leader of a popular anti-Protestant revolt in Sweden's province of Smålandia, the area turned into a somber mortar by Luther's followers almost 500 years ago, was commemorated with a monument.
So these are the facts. A community previously united for about 1,000 years is all of a sudden disintegrated by a horrible religious, revolutionary, and subversive tsunami, both in a political and a social sense. Should people have not defended themselves? Indeed, they should have defended themselves. The Catholic Counter-Reformation is a wonderful movement, which gave the birth to many extraordinary saints, such as Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus, whose main task was fighting Lutheranism. The Counter-Reformation, or the True Reformation, against the false reform, instead of focusing on the condemnation of Luther, the Church simply put forward its truth. That was the age of Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John Eudes, and all of these saints. Like the Apostle of Germany, the Blessed Peter Faber, St. Francis Xavier, St. Peter Canisius, the eminent figure, theologian, and a missionary who takes part in the Council of Trent. And the truth of the Council of Trent is noticeable in the lives of such great reformers as St. Francis de Sales and St. Charles Borromeo. All these saints, priests, and bishops who introduced the new order into clerical seminaries with a view to restoring priestly piety. This is the best response to Luther's sarcasms concerning the impracticality of chastity and saintliness. Obviously, not each of us in St. Francis or St. Rita were all sinners. The Catholics occasionally reacted, sometimes in the wrong way. The higher the stakes, the more dramatic and tragic the clash. For 50 years, Europe goes through wars brought on by these events. These are all tragedies, great tragedies. They need to be averted, but not by lies, for heaven's sake.
Luther is not a reformer. Luther is the first and the most important revolutionary of the second millennium. The revolutions which were to come, the French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, would take the Lutheran Revolution of 1517 as an example.
And every one of the revolutions begins and ends as an attack against the Catholic Church.
All the revolutions usurped fine words, but gave these very words the opposite meaning.
Luther is looked upon as the founder of freedom, and he's a denier of human freedom. And he is the father, in many respects, of the modern world, in being a mixture of contradictions in the sense of nice-sounding words that produce a reality in which what really dominates is the most brutal will.
In German culture, already in the 19th century, we come across the use of the term Führer, a leader, with regard to Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the first Führer in German history. Great celebrations are held to mark the successive anniversaries of the Reformation. In 1817, at the Wartburg Festival, Germany's first book burning takes place. Books with references to the country's Catholic past and works referring to the synthesis of Roman law end up at the stake to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Reformation.
So where will this Germany, which suddenly comes to hate itself and its own roots, turn to? Where will it seek its identity? In pagan mythology.
No wonder then that the first Führer's writings were very popular in the second Führer's times. It was then that by the will of its voters, regrettably, predominantly of Protestant background, Germany was under National Socialist power. And it was then that the so-called Judenschriften, that is, Luther's texts against the Jews, were reprinted.
At the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis stated, "We did what Luther says and recommends in his texts." In On the Jews and Their Lies, Luther advises the princes, "What should we Christians do with this obnoxious and condemned people, the Jews?" And he gives the following answer. First, it is advisable that all their synagogues should be burned to the ground. Secondly, their private houses should be razed and destroyed. Let the young and strong Jews, men and women alike, be made to earn their living by the sweat of their brow.
Ideas are dangerous. Ideas are dangerous. If they are rooted in something other than God and truth, they're dangerous. And in that sense, they're diabolical.
Il dira vers la fin de sa vie que
Towards the end of his life, he confessed that while he was working on his critique of the Mass, the devil was his theology professor. He even went on to say that Satan himself inspired his treatise on abolishing the Holy Mass. That is what he said.
Yes, and now Luther says he is more and more tired. I am tired, he tells his drinking companions. I will have myself eaten by the worms soon. They will get a fat doctor, these worms. I'll die. We old people have to die. He was only 63, so he wasn't old. We, the old ones, have to keep dying until we look the devil in the arse. I looked the devil in the arse.
Luther dies in 1546 after a night of binge drinking. We do not know if Martin Luther died a natural death. We don't know whether his death was caused by alcohol abuse or whether someone assisted him, or whether he himself precipitated his demise. We have a testimony of his personal servant who says how Luther was found dead. He was found hanged in the morning.
And then he was buried in All Saints Church in Wittenberg, the church he always called All Devils Church. The people carrying the corpse, university professors, were no longer capable of proceeding due to the repulsive smell that had grown to be unbearable. Even though the body was kept in a sealed metal coffin.
Luther decided that the principle of death and the principle of evil were both principles of God's higher development. For Luther's God stimulates his own higher development thanks to death, thanks to his being life and death.
What Martin Luther has given us these centuries later is a culture that rejects God or minimizes God so much that he may as well not be there. There is some other substitute for God. It can be the state, it can be a leader, it can be whatever. On a theological level, from Luther, it's me. It's you, it's anybody watching this. You're your own little God.
Protestantism is a revolution, a revolt. Once you have been through one, you desire another. That's obvious, so why should you be satisfied with Luther? No, you won't rest with Luther, so you get the Methodists and other Protestant denominations.
Protestantism is constantly mutating because it doesn't have any bedrock principles. It doesn't have bedrock moral principles. Protestantism gave the world contraception. The Anglicans in 1930, the Lambeth Conference. Protestantism gave us abortion in the United States. Majority of the U.S. justices on the Supreme Court that voted for abortion were Protestant. These are the results of the thinking of Martin Luther.
Luther keeps negating. He negates the transubstantiation. He negates the Eucharist, the Mother of God, the saints. He curses the Pope, negates the Church and free will. Actually, Luther negates our entire faith. Over the past 50 years, we have been witnessing a Protestantization of the Catholic Church. A case in point is the participation of Protestant theologians in editing the new Mass under Pope Paul VI in 1969. Protestants took an active part in shaping the new liturgy, even though they were known to regard the Mass as a mere meeting rather than a re-sacrifice of Christ. It is a question of choice, and these are the crossroads. There exists a moment of choice, and once you become Luther's admirer, you are no longer a Catholic. If the Catholic Church, instead of opposing Lutheranism, puts her arms around it in an ecumenical embrace, then what it embraces is a corpse in an advanced state of decomposition.
This isn't to say that they're all evil-minded. Many of them are probably very well-intentioned. But we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about the principles. And the principles are Protestantism exists simply to stand in protest against the Catholic Church. And that simply cannot be just brushed over with, nice smiles and handshakes and, pretty ceremonies.
The Jubilee commemorating the 500th anniversary of Luther's revolt is preceded by a series of unprecedented manifestations. The representatives of the Catholic and Lutheran hierarchy sign a joint declaration, From Conflict to Communion, Martin Luther's statue makes its way to the Vatican. The Swedish cities of Lund and Malmö celebrate the so-called ecumenical dialogue at the highest level.
Okay, we expect a great celebration. That's why we're here.
Yeah, and it's every time we meet together, we're going to need something to talk about. Today it's a very big day for us in the Christian unity. So.
What is going to be celebrated?
Yeah, it's a remembrance of the Reformation and the contribution that Luther has given the Church, his insights on the Bible and the faith and the grace. So this is some important stuff that we need to remember, and also look ahead and to gather in hope. This is the theme for this event.
So, what is the future? Are Catholics going to become Protestants?
I think this is a great way of thinking, which is very much Luther's way of thinking, that we can learn from one another, that we can see each other in the eye and with respect and positive thinking. What do we have in common, which is so much more than what we disagree on?
What do we have in common?
Our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That's a crucial, and the most important thing.
Are the Catholics going to become Protestant, or the Protestants are going to become Catholic?
I don't know. Maybe they meet in the middle and become a little of both.
But it's not so big difference, I think. I think we should be together as a...
The core is the same.
Yeah, I think it's the same, almost the same thing. Yeah, I think.
A long list of theological disagreements that we now have laid behind us about the communion, about a lot of other things. It's history now. Now we look forward.
Time to cooperate.
Time to cooperate.
And to forget what has been.
Yes. Our Archbishop is here too. She's a woman, a very good person.
I mean, most people have left our church. I mean, they are still members in the Lutheran Church, but they are never attending a service. They are absent.
Why?
Don't ask me. It's the same in every Western European country.
But I can answer. I'm a Reformed Catholic from the We Are the Church movement. And for example, even the Reformed Catholics are moderate when it comes to abortion. They don't want to abort, but they say that when a child is abused and get pregnant, or when a woman's life is in danger, or if she's raped, then we should have an abortion, that it would be legal with an abortion. We also say yes to preventive medel, what do you call that in English? Preventive, And we also say yes to take communion after divorce. We also want female priests. We also want priests to be married if they want. So to say that it's free will, the celibacy.
And you still want us to call you Catholics?
Yes, because we love the Mass. We love our saints. We love the Church. It doesn't mean that we're not Catholic just because we want us to be more humanized. So are you against abortion? What is it? Who are you?
I am against abortion.
But who are you?
Filmmakers from Poland.
Oh, from Poland. Okay. Well, you're very, very conservative in Poland. Okay.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Yeah.